Welcome to Lit Happens, Unpacking Senior English. I'm Adriel.
And I'm Belle.
We're experienced English teachers dedicating to supporting both new and experienced educators in a world in which we are often time poor, to empower our students to excel in their English studies.
If you're an English teacher like us, navigating this curriculum, then this podcast is designed with you in mind. And our mission really is to break down the complexities by unpacking English nationally. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Lit Happens. Adriel and Bella here, as always, to help guide you through the intricacies of senior English. So today, Adriel, we're going to be covering for our lovely listeners the Module C, Craft of Writing. And I think that will be nice because if you listen to our previous episode, we did Reading to Write, which is the Year 11 first term. And this Module C, Craft of Writing, really is like the HSC version, isn't it? Like it's the next step of it, isn't that? Yeah, exactly. Okay. So what I thought we might do first is thought we might just talk about the rubric and talk about like what the objective and the point of the module is, and noting the differences in the rubric between the examining of the craft of writing in other texts and authors, but also the component, which is the skills part of the rubric, which is the how we support students in crafting good writing.
Yep. Cool. So we're sort of looking at the craft of writing unit, like you just said, as a stepping stone from the reading to write unit. And again, you go back to like the title. Yep, it's the craft of writing. So you think about this, in year 11, they've learned reading to write. So they've read good quality texts in order to facilitate their creative and their critical writing, which is sort of what we discussed at length in the last podcast. But in the craft of writing now, this is now where we're actually getting to the significance of the writing process. So we're extending their writing skills. We're strengthening and extending, I guess, their writing skills. I guess one of the objectives for students is, the fact that they want to deepen their understanding of writing as an art form, that will strengthen confidence when it comes to crafting some powerful texts. And that's something that I've been privy enough or fortunate enough to be at the Marking Center for the craft of writing, and a lot of this sort of stuff is going to be quite significant when it comes to students having a very good understanding of writing as a form. The students that will do well in the HSC are the ones that have a deep understanding, and then this sort of hopefully what we delve into a little bit in this.
Lovely. Can I just introduce, just for any teachers who might be starting off teaching HSC and I'm not super familiar, your Module C Craft of Writing gets assessed in paper 2 of the HSC exam. And it's always a written response, right? Sometimes students have the option of the text type in which they can respond. In other HSC years, they get selected the text type. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and it could vary in terms of your mark structure as well for the last section of paper 2 here. Obviously, out of 20 marks, we've had various combinations of mark structures, which range from the 15 and 5 from your Part A to your Part B, to the 12 and the 8, to the 10 and the 10, to a full 20 marker. So like it just depends, and we have to prep our students for all of this when it does come to our craft of writing module.
So is it fair to say in general they get given some sort of prompt or statement or stimulus that they have to write a piece in either imaginative or persuasive or discursive, and sometimes that's optional. And then in some years, the exam has, like you said, that second component in the breakdown of marks where they have to then reflect on their crafting ability and reflect on how they went about producing that particular text.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, so they will definitely receive a stimulus, which they associate with some of the text that they have looked at as part of the prescribed list for Mod C. Sometimes they could ask for explicit reference to the Mod C text, or Mod A or Mod B, so it's a variety of texts.
Yeah.
But then also, generally what we've seen in the past papers is the students are provided with a piece of stimulus material which they would definitely develop their writing off of.
Okay, lovely. So if we were to just start then breaking down the rubric, anyone who's got the copy in front of them, or if you're not familiar with where to get it, go on NESA or the education website, look at the HSC prescriptions list. You'll find it there. I'm on page 21 for anyone who's playing along at home. But if you look at the first few paragraphs, there's the focus on examining good quality writing before we move on to the actual crafting. So I thought, let's talk about maybe the key aspects of that, examining quality writing. So we're asking, teachers to support students in looking at how texts are written for specific audiences and purposes. Students, again, that word appreciation keeps coming out in the HSC rubrics, doesn't it? That they appreciate, examine, and analyze at least 2 short prescribed texts from the list here. So what are some skills that you teachers should be guiding your students in when you're looking at least 2 of these prescribed texts? What are we doing here for this part of the rubric?
Yep. So you've sort of mentioned here right at the beginning, the objective for this part of the rubric is the fact that students have to learn how to tailor their writing for these different purposes and audiences. And that's very, very important for them to understand. And they need to hone their understanding of, examples of tone, maybe structure, style, amongst many other features of the text, structural language, etc., allow for this meaning to be conveyed through their writing. So I guess one of the starting points would be, ensure that your students have a good understanding of the terminology. So a good glossary of keywords that they can use in the various forms of writing that they'll be exposed to in the craft of writing phase. So provide them with a glossary. NESA does a great glossary with just key verbs, but there's some great websites out there. You can develop your own, which, you might think might suit your students more if you know how to explain things, and really give this to the students as we start this, because they need to understand, what are some of those key elements when it comes to the different forms of writing. So really scaffold that right at the beginning. You probably also look at language evaluation. Okay, so we're looking at creative language in particular for the craft of writing, for the creative, imaginative component of this rubric. And this is where you might look at, providing students with a variety of short texts, excerpts from poems, short stories, maybe even advertisements. And you might get them to, identify examples of figurative language, which we know are basic ones, which are like similes, metaphors, alliteration. But, try and extend them. Try and look at some of the more complex ones after you've got them in. You've hooked them in. Okay, they understand. You build their confidence with the simple ones, and then you move towards, developing a greater understanding of some of the more complex, intricate techniques that writers use with their language. But also, the fact that when we're doing, this idea of examining quality writing, you want them to be practicing and you want them to be involved in the practice of identifying and applying creative language devices to enhance. That word enhance means to add value to their writing. Okay, it's not just using these techniques for the sake of using them. That's a key thing that must be noted.
So being very aware of how and why they're using it. Okay.
Exactly. And it's
deliberate.
It's intentional. There needs to be an intentionality as to why you're using these sorts of techniques. It's not just because my teacher told me, or it's not just because I needed to add a metaphor in there for the sake of adding it. Well, why are you using it? Because like we just mentioned, in the exam, you could have a reflection worth 10 marks. Now, if you're not reflecting on your craft, which is, one of the elements I'm speaking about here, or you don't have anything to say about it, you can just say, oh, I just wrote this or used this because I thought I had to add this. Well, you're doing the student a disservice, aren't you? If they don't understand the true purpose here. But yeah, look, it's probably one of the key things when we are looking at these things, so the language evaluation, but also understanding the fact that they need to tailor their writing for these different purposes and audiences when it comes to examining quality writing.
Right. And I think as well, it's probably worthwhile we talk a little bit about how Module C, Craft of Writing, is very unique compared to the other modules, in that it's not necessarily meant to be studied as an entire standalone. It's meant to be studied alongside your other modules. And if you're teaching the advanced course, you want to be interweaving it. So I know one of the things that I was taught to do was a great way to start off with introducing the skills of craft of writing is by, even in your first module, common module, if you have some related text to that common module, you can introduce related or wide reading text in those different text types, a persuasive, a discursive, and imaginative. And, even if you haven't actually started analyzing the rubric in that aspect, you're already priming the students for those skills, because I think with a module like this, sometimes you've got to be quite strategic maybe about where you place it for study. Like some schools tend to do, once they've done their common module, then they might introduce it towards the end of term or when they've got a bit of a gap. And also, I guess, being strategic about at least two texts that they choose from the list. I was always taught to, and it served, I think, me and my class pretty well. I was taught to try and be a bit strategic and think about which of those text types from the list not only are going to engage the students and offer them something in terms of their consideration of craft, but maybe also have some connection to ideas or techniques across their other modules. Because like you said, in the examination, sometimes they are asked to draw on a key idea from a Module C text, or an idea or a language feature from Module C or any of the other modules. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, no, it's very important for you to sort of consider this when it comes to your programming. And I guess backward mapping as to, again, it all depends on how you guys have your assessment structure through the year as well. Depends what schools you go to. Like some of us are in the public system, some of us are in the private system, and the term lengths vary. But keeping all of that into consideration, I generally, whilst in the public sort of system, working through there, you'd have a 10-week term on average, and you might have your assessments in week 8, 7 or 8, generally speaking, where you have the last 2 weeks then to go through some texts from Mod C, if you want to work it out that way. Or as Belle has just mentioned, you might, interweave it into maybe one lesson every 2 weeks during the course of a term, every week if you have the capacity to do so, just so students are engaging with good quality texts right from the beginning.
And you're
then
right.
obviously, and then obviously you've got like that last term, which you will have a bit of time, but this is where you want to get them writing, in preparation for the HSC, for the craft of writing phase.
Absolutely. I think, like, you made a very great point there. It is very dependent on your school's scope and sequence, your assessments, your pattern of study. And I guess I just want to suggest that there are lots of different ways into Module C. And if we sort of stop thinking about it as we've got to do like everything in a chunk of 3, 4, 5 weeks together, like, you absolutely, I think this is a module you can break down and slowly introduce it, and then hit the rubric. And then, like you said, spend that last term, getting students really to write. I think if we're just, the more thoughtful I have been in the past about where and how I place my Mod C and my Mod C text, I really realized the difference it made on not only the students' confidence with that module, but their ability to, see how whatever they're crafting has been influenced by all of kind of their modules, not just the 2 texts they read in craft of writing.
No, exactly right. It's definitely something to play around with, I think. Experiment with.
So maybe just what we can just kind of talk about a little bit here is the engaging students with some of the Module C texts, what we have used before, or what text we like that seems to work, or activities. So I was thinking, looking at that list when I taught it with advanced, when I'm introducing craft of writing, I really like to start with Zadie Smith's That Crafty Feeling, because she is giving that introduction to what is creative writing, what is this process. And she always uses this really great analogy that I use to connect with my students, and we talk about it. She says the creative writing can be looked at like this. Some people, they like to have the the bones of the house first, you know, the frames. Then they like to put the walls. Then they like to add the aspects. But she said some people like to focus in detail in the room. What do I see? What do I think? And so she really, I think in that article, expresses this idea of the process of crafting. And getting students to think about how do you consider the process and the craft that your other prescribed text that you're examining, what that author has done, and how maybe you can use that as an idea for yourself, or use what they're using in their piece as like a part of your crafting toolkit.
Yeah, no, definitely. And like you were just mentioning, you know, the fact that they have to engage with those prescribed texts, you go back to that question, like why? Or why are we doing this? And, you know, what's the focus when we do engage with these texts? And you get this sort of idea where, you know, when students then start to examine a lot of these works from established writers, what they do is they gain insights into some of those complex ideas that are conveyed through the language, the structure, the form. And they're able to then sort of see, you know, the diversity of writing styles. Because as we know in English, like it's not just one, like this not just one answer, which can be good for certain students, and it can be frustrating for other students because like, oh, just tell me, sir, like this is the formula that I need, and I'll be able to get full marks. Oh, it's not really like that. It's the nature of our subject. It's quite subjective, and if they can diversify their styles of writing or be exposed to a diversity of styles of writing and how language can be used creatively in these multiplicity of texts, well, then they've got like a good base there to go off and craft their own writing. And you can sort of see this, you know, in the fact that when they look at these two prescribed texts, as well as you've mentioned, you know, variety of independent texts as well. Like it doesn't just have to be the focus on the two prescribed texts or three prescribed texts that you might look at. You know, throw in lots of different types of text. Like I think you mentioned in the last pod, you know, have a look at, say, Sydney Morning Herald. They've got some great discursive essays, or any form of, you know, news organization that might have the essay sections. I just be mindful when you are looking at some of these that you aren't looking at things that are written up in like 1 or 2 seconds. Like just be mindful of the scholarly nature. Of these essays.
I guess that was something a few years ago we didn't have to think about whether they were AI produced or what. So that's a really good point that you make.
So just be mindful of that. Anyway, you brought that sort of idea up there. What, you know, this exposure to a variety of different texts is the fact that it broadens students to, like we said, broadens their understanding of those different styles, themes, and techniques that are used across a variety of texts, which they can then embed into their own craft. So that engagement with the prescribed and the wide reading text is very, very important for them to get involved. So, you know, here's an example. Now, you might look at an excerpt of a Shakespearean play for an activity, and, you know, then compare it to a contemporary novel. This is just example's sake. And you might compare how each of those writers use the language to convey themes such as maybe love, you know, how is that conveyed, or justice, or conflict, or whatever it might be, like big picture ideas. And then you can break it down. How have they crafted that idea? How have they crafted that concept for a specific purpose? You know, again, I'm just throwing those texts out there just for example's sake. Just be mindful what texts are used in the prescriptions and the text list. But when you want them engaging with the text, you want them analyzing with the key sort of structures, language, features, etc., etc.
No, but I agree. I think you're right. It's so worthwhile because I think when you allow students to see and you note, sometimes they don't see it and you guide them, but nonetheless, and you get them to note the different styles. Like I find students that I have taught and whatever they produce for Module C, they tend to latch on to the style that they're like most interested in, right? Or that uses techniques that they like or they're interested in. And when they do then craft their Module C response and then they write their reflection, when they've connected with that text, you can see it come through when they talk about in their reflection what's inspired them to craft their piece.
Exactly.
You know, and they might say, I liked how this author used, you know, metaphor. And so, but what I've done, because this is my purpose and my message, is I've used it this way. But I think the more they see, kind of the merrier, because it starts to show students not only the possibilities, but gives a bit more of a chance that they might find a writer or a style that they really like, that hopefully they, I guess it's not so much emulate. We're not wanting them to write like these writers. We're just wanting them to deepen their own writing style, but using those texts and techniques as like the springboard, right? Like a good example, consider how you might craft it, right?
Yeah, it's like an influence. I guess that's the word.
Right.
How have you influenced their writing, and that's what we're using these prescribed texts for, and the variety of other texts for.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I think we've talked a fair bit about why we examine the prescribed texts. And I just want to say one more thing, I think, before we move on is sometimes students, I think, get bogged down and think they've got to write kind of full-on analytical analysis on these prescribed texts. And while there will be some close reading taking place, I think it's good for teachers and students to remember the aim is, like you said, to springboard and develop some connections and influence, not to make judgment calls necessarily on the nature. Like what do you think about that?
Yeah, look, you're not specifically like analyzing and evaluating the text for the purpose of writing a formal persuasive essay for this module. The closest you'll probably come to that would be maybe the discursive form of writing, which is a term that students can often get scared of. But I think it's something that I think is the easiest form of writing for the contemporary student, especially as a teacher as well, because it's just basically about a formal sort of discussion, isn't it? If we look at the roots or the basic principles of it. But what are you doing in that form of writing? Well, you're looking and you're providing multiple points of view that foster a ability to get your audience to think, think about a certain topic that's being presented. And as you were just mentioning, students can often get bogged down in the fact that, in my previous 2 units of work on the modules, I've been doing a deep dive into, how the texts are constructed, and this is how they're used, and, et cetera, et cetera. You still might do that, like you mentioned, to a point where you're looking at how things are used, but it's like, well, you're going beyond now the how. Now you're looking at applying it in your own writing. It's like, well, this is how this text has done it. Now, how can I use elements of what I think are good that might be beneficial for me in my own writing, whether it be creative, whether it be persuasive, whether it be discursive, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to that aspect then. That very kind of last point of the rubric is that students have the opportunities to strengthen their skills in producing highly crafted, imaginative, discursive, persuasive, and informative texts. So you just touched on discursive a little bit. So I think it's interesting you said, I think when these prescriptions came out and we all saw discursive, we were all like a little bit, I think, panicked. But once you take that step back, you realize that it's actually a very, very flexible, fun style of writing. I think once students do their first discursive piece, they realize, oh, actually it's not that bad, and there's quite a lot of flexibility here. And I always find the first one is like you got to rip that Band-Aid off. But I think that's really good. So because potentially they could be asked in the HSC exam to write a discursive piece of writing about a key idea, that they saw in Module C or other texts. So what are some of the stylistic features of the discursive writing that you would see in like the examination conditions?
So one thing I'll just preface this with is a lot of students will go back to comfort, and they'll often go back to imaginative text. Please encourage your students not to be scared of this form, because that, like I mentioned before, students are we're naturally inclined to be discursive in the way that we think as human beings. We think, say for example, an idea is presented. I think there's one article that we've always given our students as a pursuit of happiness, or the business of happiness, where they underscore this anecdote of Winnie the Pooh, and how you've got this bounding Tigger that goes along all the time, and you've got the juxtaposed image of Winnie the Pooh, and how society is always chasing this high, this happiness. But the idea is, you're posing a question, you're responding to a question, you're looking at the multiple ways in which that question can be addressed, and that is what discursive writing is in essence, in a formal manner, rather than just a debate or an argument one side. You're looking at scholarly backed points. Okay, cool, like this says this, but then this says this about the certain topic. I know one thing teachers can often fall into with the discursive form of writing is, think about a discussion. We generally then tend to think of a discussion as a for and against argument, which I would say it's a good starting point to think about
Mm-hmm.
discursive writing, but really
Mm-hmm.
extend yourself when it comes to discursive writing to think about this idea of multiplicity of perspectives when it comes to an idea.
Yeah.
You're presenting perspective from, yes, both sides, or different. I like to say different perspectives. It's not necessarily for and against. It's just
Yeah.
like, okay, you could look at something like this. You could look at it through this lens. You could look at it through this lens, and but
Mm-hmm.
you're getting your audience, your marker to think about is the idea that's being presented. Oh yeah, that's pretty interesting. That's cool.
Yeah.
Like they've
Yeah.
really thought about this. Like
Mm-hmm.
um, it can be informal in nature. Like sorry,
Mm-hmm.
not informal. I mean, it's formal in its nature. It's not colloquial, if that makes
Yes.
sense. It's
Yes.
it because you got to understand your audience is still a marker at the end of the day
Yes.
for your students. So
Yes.
really get them to engage with good writing. Have a
Mm-hmm.
look at like some great discursive articles that can be found online through university sort of journals and all these sorts of things. There's
Mm-hmm.
plenty out there. Um, and I mean, you could even look at a text like Steve Jobs' How to Live Before You Die. Yeah, it's presented as a speech, but it's got discursive qualities to it, same as
Yeah.
J.K. Rowling's speech.
That's right. Yes, that's
You
right.
know, so there are elements of discursive sort of the discursive writing embedded throughout their pieces of writing, albeit they are persuasive speeches technically. They've got discursive elements which you can still highlight to students. But yeah,
Yes.
in essence, it's like a glorified like discussion, isn't it? Where you're looking
Yeah.
at a multiplicity of perspectives in order to present a point of view. And I
I
often say
think
this,
that's
yeah, a
sorry.
good discursive essay will have your reader thinking about the topic that you've
Yes.
just presented. So
Yes. No, I think that's great, that idea of that multiplicity of perspective, even if you as the writer, you don't necessarily, you can write a discursive piece where you have your own kind of perspective, but you're peppering it with multiple ones. You
yeah,
also can say, I don't really know, and that's the fun of it too. And this is why this
exactly.
conversation. I like that you can, categorize and use subheadings. Like you can be
Mm,
really playful,
mm,
anecdote, pop culture, and you're still formal in how you express yourself because,
yeah,
like you said, adult, teachers,
mm,
markers are
mm,
assessing these, but it gives a lot of room for, I think, students to be a bit more like maybe like playful or stylistic.
yeah,
If some students like storytelling, they can use that to
yeah.
use anecdote to pepper the different perspectives. I think it's nice for it if your student is doing it pretty effectively, like you hear their voice, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's like when you think about your persuasive appeals when it comes to literature, we've got our
Yeah.
pathos, which is one that we really,
Mm-hmm.
really engage with, especially when it comes to our imaginative writing. You've got your
Yeah.
logos, which you would probably associate with a lot of your essay writing, as it is quite
Yes.
structured. And
Yes.
then ethos. And I think
Mm-hmm.
discursive writing actually takes a hold of all three. It allows you to manipulate all three persuasive
Yes.
appeals and get students to think about all three. And ethos is there's ethics. So you've got your logic,
Mm-hmm.
your facts, your statistics, and your ethics. It's like, well, you're getting people to think about, values, ethics, morals within their own world.
Yes.
That the writing definitely then prefaces for, the marker.
Yes, absolutely. And then I think sometimes what I hear is from students is I'll just prep like an imaginative piece and I'll go in with that. But
Mm,
depending on what course you're doing, sometimes you're not given the option to write your imaginative.
yeah,
Sometimes you are, and it's open ended. And what was it? The HSC that just passed, I'm pretty sure in the advanced section, they had to write discursive.
yeah, yep,
So I think teachers and students need to be very, very aware that you need to be prepared for being able to craft an imaginative, a discursive, and even a
yeah,
persuasive piece. And when we say that, it's like you said earlier, that doesn't mean in your persuasive piece you're analyzing your mod C text. No,
yeah,
you're presenting a persuasive argument. You might have a
yeah.
call to action on a certain idea.
Mm,
And I think
mm,
that's one way to look at when you are doing persuasive and discursive is think about, like you said earlier, that balance. If you don't have a lot of balance in your perspective, then you're probably producing more of a persuasive response, especially if there's that call to action at the end. If you at the end are leaving it quite open-ended and allowing the reader to walk away with a multitude of ideas to formulate their own response, I think they're just little things that students can and teachers can be aware of to make sure, because really being asked to do a certain text type, it's really going to really delineate who's paying attention to the different styles of writing and who's not, right?
That's correct. And I will say this, like, just coming, out of some of the experiences from being able to, have that opportunity to look at this section beyond the classroom. Sometimes students can go in with like those pre-prepared pieces. So they might have one core pre-prepared imaginative piece, but they can modify it, if that makes sense.
Totally.
I really encourage this. We're going to speak a little bit about this in terms of like pre-writing, drafting, and revising very shortly. But like, it's one of the things that we really, really need to keep in mind. If your students are not going into this section of the HSC exam without something pre-prepared, it's something that we try and, like, we've been told recently not to encourage, a pre-prepared piece, but I'm gonna go with the other sort of school of thought. They need to have something as a base, because if you think about it yourself as a teacher, if you were to say, hey, you've got 40 minutes to write this, you're not producing the amount of work if you don't already have something as a pre-prepared, refined piece that you can go in there as a base. And then
I think that's
adapt on the day.
Excuse me. I think you're right. I think that's the key term, the idea of it's a base, that it's malleable, and it should be malleable. We're not saying our students just memorize one thing and they go in and reproduce it, because that's not going to work necessarily, because whatever they've initially crafted may not fit what the question's asking them to do, and then they're stuck. But I think you're right. We all need to have a basis of, here's my idea, here's how I might shape it if it's a creative, here's how I might shape it if it's a discursive, here's how I might reshape it if it's a persuasive, and go in with something. I mean, even when we have students do an in-class essay, let's say, we never say to them, just go in and do it. We always say to them, prepare something, have some analysis, memorize points or sections, or whatever the student needs to do. Each student is different. Some of them like to have a variety of options and memorize a variety and then work it on the spot. Some like to just have bones and dot points, and that works too. But I think you're right. I think it's, especially considering what students have to do in our English exams, and there's 2 papers and they're the next day. I think it's asking a lot of them if we don't actually consider that they need to have some pre-preparation. What we're asking them to do is quite a lot. It's quite a lot.
No, exactly right. But your kids that succeed are the ones that, from what we've seen in terms of your statistics, your app data, if you're privy to all this sort of stuff, it's generally the kids that have produced multiple drafts or multiple pieces of writing gone in. They're the ones that will be your high achievers. So if you're wanting to build their capacity, moving those band 3s to the band 4s, the band 4s to the 5s, and so on and so forth, really, really start to engage them with this writing process. And this is why it's called a craft. So
absolutely. No, you're right. And I think that's a really great way to think about it. Constantly bring your idea back to the craft, that idea of crafting. All right. So let's talk about the writing process. So let's talk about first the pre-writing, where students are starting to consider their Module C text, consider their other module texts and anything else they might have read, and are starting to explore the possibilities of, let's say, concepts or ideas or key techniques that they want to use when creating an imaginative piece.
Okay, so I guess we start off with your pre-writing piece here. And again, when we're looking at pre-writing, this is the stage where we're looking at encouraging our students to explore the variety of ideas. Okay, so before they even begin drafting their piece of work, you want them to explore some of those key ideas within the text that they are looking at, or else they'll be running around like a headless chook. Like, so what am I supposed to write about? Miss, what am I supposed to write about? Well, these are some key ideas. Let's get started. Okay.
Yeah.
And what you could sort of implement here is, again, going back to your brainstorming, you might have some of those Socratic discussions within your classes. You might have things like speculative thinking about, the concept. So what is this concept? How is it facilitated within this text? And, how do they want that concept then to then develop in their writing? How do they see it manifesting? And that's something that you will really want to be not specific. You want to be, getting your students to generate a wide range of ideas without worrying about structure or perfection at this stage. This is the pre-writing
Sure.
part, just put it all
Sure.
onto the page. And what this helps is, it helps to clarify their thoughts and choose the best direction for their writing. Because if they can see it, and most of them will tell you, hey, sir, I'm a visual learner. Well, okay, cool. What are we going to do about it? What are the ideas that you've got on your page? Let's start to select or highlight or color code certain things. You could even get them to pop things onto the board with different post-it notes. These are your separate ideas, like just play around with what works for your students. And, like I said, some of those activities for brainstorming. So mind mapping, you might get them to do free writing, group brainstorming sessions, or look at, short reflective essays. Like these are different things in their pre-writing concept exploration stage that they really want to engage with.
I like that. I like that a lot, especially that idea of the mapping, because I imagine then in the mapping on the board, you could do that whole class. And then the whole class can be engaged in this discussion of making connections of, we see this idea in this Mod C text, but in this way because of this technique. However, in our Module B text, it's explored in this way because of this technique and perspective. So getting students to sort of see the patterns and then springboard off of that with what they like and what they want to pursue. Okay, I like that. That's really cool.
No, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So you then move on to like the next stage, which is your drafting and revising after your pre-writing stage there. And this one we can go into a little bit more depth. Now, remember, for this stage, what we're getting students to do is to experiment with different types of language. So whether it be figurative, rhetorical, maybe linguistic devices, which will shape their writing. You could have some techniques like, I'll just point out a few here: illusion, imagery, narrative voice, characterization, tone. I think they are littered within some of these rubric points here that you could have as a starting point. And this is what I mentioned right at the beginning. Make sure they have a glossary of all of these terms. You're not introducing these terms at this stage when they're starting to construct their writing. Like they need to know this stuff at the beginning. Give them a comprehensive list. There's some great websites out there, such as, we'll give them, we're not paid subscribers or anything here, but we'll just give them a bit of a shout out. You've got Matrix Education that have great things, and then Art of Smart, fantastic resources on board. Their page that are readily available for students, and they do great work in that space as well for students. I know, we've been privy to some of the techniques that they've used because fantastic. It's all out there. But make sure the students know how to use a lot of these different devices.
Yeah.
But then again, for this stage, remember the focus is for drafting and revising. And this is a thing that students can often get bogged down with, because I think a draft is, I've written the perfect piece of writing and all I'll need is, hey, sir, or hey, miss, can you have a look at this and just tell me everything I need to change? And we all know as teachers that the drafting and revising stage, drafting in particular, isn't something that's just a one-off draft. It's something that they craft. That word craft meaning you add value every stage, every step of the way. So you might start off with, it's a process, isn't it? And you're starting off with, let's say, for example, refining their introductions or their ideas within their introductions if they're developing a creative piece. Maybe you're looking at experimenting on how different language choices might affect meaning, tone, maybe, reader engagement, because there might be different parts of the text which they really need to focus on. But each time you might say, hey, I want a little bit more, of a focus on characterization here, or a distinct voice here would better suit this piece. And you get the student to then go off, develop it further, and then come back to you. So that's that drafting phase. It's not, or drafting and crafting, I would like to say. The revising phase is then, looking over it and being like, okay, cool. Like, maybe, one of the good things I've done recently is give them like a bunch of, like, say 10 questions that you might ask as a marker. Put it down as a paper, give them a checklist. Have you answered these
Yep.
things? Tick
Yep.
them, and how so? Don't just get them to tick them and just give you, yeah, I've done it, because they can just tick it off, as we do when it comes to our courses. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Let's
Oh, yeah.
just tick these little boxes.
Mhm.
But
Stop giving
the
away our
students-
secrets, Adriel.
yeah, sorry, I shouldn't be saying these sorts of things, eh? But
No, you're fine.
but these are the things that,
It's
we're being
true.
real here. The students
No,
do this.
absolutely. They
They're
do.
smart. It's efficiency, isn't it? But
Yeah.
get them
Oh,
to
and
be
then saying
intentional.
to them, you tell me the 2 things you want me to look at, because then it actually makes them think about, oh, what do I think I need to fix up here?
Exactly. And you think about what that
Yeah.
helps with then when it comes to the exam. Like, I always say this to my students, the reason I'm like this when it comes to drafting, I'm not telling you this is how you should write it. I
Yeah.
might guide them, but I might say, well, you
Mhm.
have to go off and do this on your own. Is because who's going to hold your hand when you're in the HSC
Yes.
exam room? No one.
Yes.
It's yourself. You're
Absolutely.
going to be, going to go through your processes. So you want to build this process of how they craft their pieces right from the beginning through the entirety of, the study of this module. And I think that's
Yeah.
very important.
No, I think it is. I think it is. And I think, again, if we're thinking about scaffolding, I think scaffolding is wonderful. I have found in my experience there is an element, depending on the students, if you over scaffold, they might
Yeah.
not then make their own more unique interpretations.
Yeah.
So I think there's a very fine line. You know your students in the room. There might be different pockets of these kids need very heavy scaffolding. These kids need a little bit to get them started, or these kids just need to see a sample and then they take it and they make it their own. Because
Exactly.
I know the more that I do this, the more conscious I am of who needs that scaffolding as part of their process and who
Yeah.
needs the more example and the guiding to, because I'm conscious, I don't want to stifle their ideas. It's their idea. Like, I don't want to say, don't do this, don't do that, because it's not their piece then, is it?
Yeah, exactly
But
right.
we can guide them and say, I think it would be even more impactful if you consider X, Y, Z, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
Let's just talk about now then so they've done their pre-writing, they got their idea, they drafted, they've gone through this process where they've got a pretty solid piece of writing here. How do we move now into the revising and the development of their reflection statement? Because they may, or sometimes may not be, we've seen that in the HSC too, asked to provide a statement where they reflect on their crafting choices and how they created their particular piece.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So this is where students need to go back to considering their purpose, audience, and context. It's very important. Yep. So throughout the whole sort of drafting and revision phase, you'll see that students should be conscious of, how the purpose, again, their audience and context shape their writing. And if they have a good understanding of these elements, they understand then how these elements influence how a writer decides on things like tone, structure, vocab, style. So, for example, if we're looking at like a persuasive piece of any form, it might be aimed at like a specific, maybe political audience, which might differ greatly from that personal narrative or piece of reflective writing that they consider. So when it comes to then their reflective writing stages, they need to consider on that medium-specific purpose, audience, and context. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. That's yep.
Yeah, and when I sort of look at this, this final sort of stage when it comes to purpose, if they don't have that understanding of purpose, if they don't have that grounding in purpose and that audience and context, well, then your reflection won't make sense.
Yes.
So
they won't correlate, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think the thing is, the reflection statement is really there to allow students to have that opportunity to explain their process and thought process and explain what their creative piece is, what their intent is, like we said, the purpose, the meaning, perhaps what their conceptual or didactic intent is, who they're writing it for, what influenced them in writing it, and then they actually need to go through and do an analysis of their key or best features of their creative response, right?
Yeah.
Like they're examining their own craft. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So they need to make a justification of why they've implemented certain techniques, certain features of their text, certain linguistic devices. And those that do it with confidence and know really what they're writing about in their reflection are the ones that will generally be scoring their top marks. So again, this goes back to making sure your students understand the purpose, the context, the audience, and understanding techniques, those linguistic, stylistic features and devices. They need to have a very good understanding of these.
I think it's good to, when they're thinking about what techniques, I don't know about you, but I often suggest to them, so you want to have maybe one or two really big structural techniques. So if you used an extended metaphor, if you used a more nonlinear structure, if you have a central motif, and then maybe talking about, a characterization or tone or atmosphere. And is it good for them as well to have like a couple of examples from
So
their
when
text? Okay.
yeah, no, exactly. You're hitting it right on the head there. It's like the thing is, you want techniques, holistic techniques that run through the entirety of their piece.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
like you've just
You're
mentioned,
really
things like
big.
your extended metaphors, your motifs, your big ones, because then out of that, then they can reflect on, okay, cool, like this metaphor was used here, but it extends on to, this larger sort of extended motif or metaphor, and then really then has its strength in, why you employed it within your writing, and gives them a greater scope then to reflect on it in their reflection, rather than just that one-off simile or piece of alliteration that they used for the sake of using it.
Yes, that's right. I was thinking that I don't want them to just tack on token techniques. It's big picture. So if they're thinking about how they might structure their reflection, first think about, what is my purpose, audience, and context? Like, what is the point of my story? My story is about what and why. And then what big techniques have I been used to shape that idea and that message to come through? And then alongside that, what are some specific moments in my story, or lines or quotes or dialogue or whatever else?
Quote your text directly. That's very, very important.
Okay.
You need to be quoting your text verbatim. Like it's super duper important for the students to understand this, because a lot of times they'll paraphrase. Oh yeah, this is, and in anything, if we're providing textual evidence, you want the exact quote, the direct quote. So I think you were just mentioning that, and I think that's very, very significant that we emphasize with our students.
Okay, that's great. And then I think, like, everybody who's listening, remember that you would have started looking at these skills in reading to write in the prelim course.
Yeah.
And more often than not, to everyone, mostly everyone, their assessment for that tends to be a creative, imaginative piece with a reflection statement. So just remember that you're in craft of writing, like you're reinforcing these skills. And students might have produced a really great response and reflection in prelim that they could use as a starting point and bring that across, and use some of the techniques that worked really well for them, or some of the ideas. Like there's never like a ground zero, really, is there? Like there's lots of things along the way that they can use to springboard off of.
Yeah. Don't recreate the wheel. Get them to reflect on the work that they've done in their prelim course. What are the techniques? Like it might be like in your first lessons, your first week doing like the craft of writing, or what are some of the things that we looked at in year 11? Because most of you will have these students from year 11 into year 12. So you know your students by now. Get them to bring their old notes in. And this is why we emphasize the importance of writing your notes in your book, where they can reflect upon these things. It's that process, where we're looking at the practice and the development of this skill, which this unit in itself does build off of from the prelim course.
Wonderful. That's really helpful. There's some really, really great tips. So if we just move into now, then I think you have done an amazing job, very thoroughly have covered Module C. Just ending off with some final thoughts and maybe some encouragement moving forward with this module.
So The last few things, like as I did with the reading to write sort of unit here, previously in our previous episode. Remember, the goal for this unit is for students to produce highly polished, highly crafted texts. It's
Yep.
not just that one-off, hey sir, hey miss, I've just done one draft and I've developed this. It's no, you're working on crafting these texts for the entirety of however long you're doing these units, whatever time you've allocated to them. So a writing portfolio might be something that you might consider where, you know, an
Yeah.
in-class
Yep.
formal thing where you can have a variety of things where students keep a hold of their writing, and you might say, well, this week we're focusing on creative stories or discursive essays or speeches or whatever it might be. And then they've got like their folder, which they can go back to. Okay, cool. This is everything I know about each of these relative text types.
That's
So
a great idea.
yeah, you know, like these are just little things that you could do. Now, again, time permitting, it depends on your schedule, what works.
Yeah.
And you might say, well, my kids are really good at creative writing. I need to focus on discursive essays. So
Yes,
that's where
absolutely.
your teacher discretion comes into it. But
Mm.
remember, when we're looking at this idea of refining their writing, they need to meet high standards of the following elements. Okay, so they need their writing, if it's highly polished or highly crafted, it needs to have great clarity, a high standard of clarity, coherence, and creativity. Okay, this work is expected to be, you know, well organized, and it must effectively communicate ideas which engage the reader. So those are some key things when it comes to their writing. Whereas the reading to write unit was just them experimenting and practicing, you know, the different elements of writing that they've gained from the good text that they've read. Now we've transitioned to that phase where they've been exposed to a whole heap of texts across the
Yeah.
whole their stage 6 course. And now it's about crafting these great sort of pieces of work which they can take with them into the exam. You know, this is
Yeah.
what we're talking about. When it comes to a week before, they're not trying to write their drafts then. No, you've been working on this from like term 1 if you've done this
Yeah.
unit currently. And
And it
you know,
should
this,
be a culmination.
yeah, that's right. And this is why
Yeah.
we encourage that, you know, to do it alongside some of the modules that you are working with, because the kids are continually practicing their craft of writing.
Yeah. And the other modules in their rubric, they have that point about allowing students to engage creatively as well as analytically. So, you know, two birds, one stone. It's very, what we're doing is a lot. Our time is short. You know, we're very packed. If you're really thoughtful, you can hit those two things together. And most, you know, schools will obviously then you'll also then be able to assess your craft of writing. But if you've been working along the way in developing, then hopefully the end product that the students are going to produce in that assessment is going to be a lot stronger, because they've engaged in this process where they've reflected, rewritten, refined, and then the end product is hopefully something that's really polished, like you said, that they can also take with them going into, you know, their exam in the future.
Exactly right. Yeah.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Adrielle. Is there anything else we want to jump in with for our listeners today in this episode?
Yeah. So once again, we'll just remind you guys, you know, we are producing a whole heap of resources, which you'll find in the comments, especially as we start to move into us tech-specific ones. So keep an eye out. Please give us a follow, a like, share these podcasts if you think they're going to be beneficial for someone that you know. And yeah, like I said, we'd love your support. Get in contact with us if you have suggestions with anything that you'd like to listen to or hear about. But we're loving your support. We're loving this journey, and we're excited, you know, for the road ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure. Until next time.
See you later.